Beneath the glittering skyline of modern New York, there is a story the city rarely tells. It's not carved into the polished stone of skyscrapers or printed on postcards for tourists. It lingers in the shadows, in the forgotten corners, where the ground once swallowed every step in mud, and the air carried the weight of rot. This place was called 5 Points, and in the 1800s, it was known as the deadliest slum in America. Welcome back to Sleepy Town Radio, where the past is soft, the nights are slow, and the stories drift gently, carrying you someplace far away. Tonight, we won't walk the bright avenues of the city, you know. Instead, we'll step back into the narrow streets of a New York that smelled of coal smoke and damp wood, where voices echoed through alleys slick with rain and refuse, and where life and death lived side by side. 5 Points was not born from chance. It began as a mistake, a wound in the heart of the city that never healed. Once, this was a place of clear waters, where children played along the banks of a freshwater pond. But the pond would vanish, and in its place rose a neighborhood of sinking foundations, foul air, and overcrowded rooms where hope was a fragile thing. Yet in the midst of the darkness, there were sounds, laughter in the street, the shuffle of dancing feet, the murmur of a dozen languages mingling in the night. Because even here, in a place the city tried to forget, people still found ways to live, and sometimes to dream. So let's begin our journey to the 5 Points at the very start, when it was still a place of clear water and promise. If you were to stand here 2 centuries ago, you wouldn't hear the noise of traffic or the hum of neon lights. You would hear water, soft and steady, lapping against the shore of a deep, clear pond. They called it Collect Pond, and in those days, it was the pride of New York. The air around it was fresh, touched with the faint scent of pine from the surrounding woods. Children skipped stones across its surface, laughing as the ripples danced in widening circles. Fishermen sat on its banks, patient and quiet, pulling trout from the cool depths. For a young and growing city, it was more than a pretty place. It was life itself. Collect Pond gave clean drinking water to homes and workshops. It fed the small streams that trickled toward the east and Hudson rivers. It was the kind of natural gift a city builds itself around. And in those early years, it did just that. But a city is never still. It grows. And as New York grew in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the water began to change. Along the shore, new industries appeared. Tanneries, breweries, slaughterhouses, and factories, each one sending its waste into the pond without a thought for tomorrow. What was once the taste of clean, cold water became tinged with a sourness that no one could ignore. Day by day, the ripples turned darker. The smell that once carried pine and rain now carried something acrid, metallic, and foul. It happened slowly at first. A few dead fish, a murky haze in the shallows, but then it quickened. Black sludge clung to the edges. The voices of children grew fewer, replaced by the groan of wagon wheels hauling raw hides and the shouts of workers dumping barrels of waste straight into the water. What had been a place of rest and beauty became an open wound in the middle of the city. By the early 1800s, Collect Pond was no longer a blessing. It was a public health nightmare. Mosquitoes bred thick in the stagnant corners. The smell rose on warm days, drifting through the streets like a shadow you couldn't escape. And yet, instead of cleaning it, the city leaders chose a simpler, cheaper path. They decided to bury it. The plan sounded neat on paper. Fill in the pond, pave over the land, and build new streets and homes on solid ground. But the work was done with haste, without care for what lay beneath. They didn't drain it. They didn't dig out the rotting plants, the layers of sludge, the heaps of discarded animal remains. Instead, they dumped cartload after cartload of dirt, sand, and garbage directly into the water, smothering it in a blanket of decay. At first, it seemed to work. The pond was gone. The smell faded, just a little. Houses and shops began to rise where the water had been, but underneath, the buried waste began to rot. It released great pockets of methane gas, seeping up through the ground. The earth sagged in places, soft and treacherous. Rainwater pooled instead of draining away, turning the new streets into reeking swamps after every storm. On hot days, the stench returned, heavy and clinging, until it seemed to wrap itself around you. Those with money, those with any choice at all, moved away. They left behind empty houses and half-built streets, and in time, those spaces filled again, this time with the people who had nowhere else to go. Newly arrived immigrants from Ireland and other far-off places found rent cheap here, even if the cost was paid in sickness and hardship. And slowly, the outline of a neighborhood began to take shape, its streets converging in an odd intersection of 5 sharp corners. It would give the place its name, 5 Points. But that name, in time, would come to mean more than an intersection. It would mean the slum that grew from poisoned ground. It would mean a neighborhood born from a mistake the city buried, but could never truly hide. What was once Collect Pond, clear and full of life, was gone forever. In its place stood a patch of unstable earth, waiting for the weight of human lives to press down upon it. And soon, they would. They would bring their families, their hopes, their voices, and laughter, and find themselves in a place the rest of the city would turn its back on. From the clear waters of a pond to the foul ground of a slum, the story of 5 Points had begun. And in the years to come, the wound beneath these streets would fester until it became the most notorious place in New York. When the pond was gone, the ground never truly settled. It heaved and sagged with each season, and after heavy rains, the streets dissolved into puddles so wide you had to wade through them. On humid summer nights, the air grew thick with the sour stench that rose from below, a smell that clung to your hair, your clothes, your very breath. It was as if the buried pond was still there, whispering its decay back into the world. The people who could afford to leave did so quickly. Well-dressed families packed their belongings and moved uptown, where the streets were dry and the windows opened onto gardens instead of open sewers. Merchants closed their shops, leaving behind boarded windows and crooked signs that swung in the wind. The exodus left a hollow stillness, a sense that the neighborhood itself had been abandoned. But nature and cities do not tolerate emptiness for long. The vacant rooms, the sagging buildings, the half-paved streets, they began to fill again. Only this time, it was not the middle-class families returning. It was those who had no choice. Ship after ship arrived in the harbor, carrying men, women, and children from Ireland, Germany, and other distant places. Many had fled famine, others poverty or political unrest. They stepped ashore with everything they owned in small bundles or battered trunks, searching for somewhere, anywhere, they could afford to live. 5 Points offered rents so low they almost seemed a blessing, until you saw the rooms themselves. Here, in the shadow of City Hall, the poor found themselves crammed into rooms so narrow you could touch both walls at once. The floors tilted, the ceilings leaked, and the plaster flaked away in damp chunks. In the evenings, the streets filled with the sound of many languages, Irish brogues, the clipped syllables of German, the soft tones of Italian mingled with English, creating a chorus that belonged to no single country, yet belonged entirely to this place. By day, women leaned out of upper windows to shake dust from blankets, their faces weary from hours of washing or sewing. Men gathered in doorways, looking for day labor, or simply passing the time when work could not be found. Barefoot children darted between carts, their laughter sharp and fleeting like a match struck in the dark. And always, always, the smell. Some tried to mask it with the smoke of coal fires or the tang of cooking onions. But the damp, heavy odor of the ground could never be chased away. At night, the gas lamps flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the uneven cobblestones. The alleys became rivers of black water after rain, glistening under the lamplight. In those narrow passages, footsteps echoed strangely, as if the streets themselves were hollow. To the rest of New York, this was a place to avoid. The wealthy rarely ventured here unless escorted by police, and even the working class from other neighborhoods spoke of 5 Points with a mix of pity and fear. But for those who lived here, it was simply home. It was where they worked, where they prayed, where they buried their dead. And in time, the name 5 Points became more than just the odd intersection of streets. It became a label, one that carried with it the weight of stigma and shame. To say someone was from 5 Points was to say they were poor, desperate, perhaps even dangerous. But for the people who had been left behind here, and for those who had come seeking the smallest foothold in a new country, it was also a place of survival. They endured the damp, the stench, the soft, sinking earth, because beyond these streets, life was no kinder. And here at least, they had each other. From the clear waters of a pond to the foul ground of a slum, 5 Points had now become a world of its own. And within its cramped rooms and crooked streets, life, in all its hardship and resilience, pressed on. Step inside one of the tall, narrow buildings that lined the crooked streets of 5 Points, and the first thing you would notice was the air. It wasn't just stale, it was heavy. It wrapped itself around you like a damp blanket, smelling faintly of coal smoke, unwashed clothes, and the sourness of standing water. These were the tenements. Cheap, hastily built, and endlessly divided to squeeze in as many paying tenants as possible. A single floor might hold several families, each crammed into one small room that served as bedroom, kitchen, and living space all at once. The walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's cough in the middle of the night, or the creak of their bed frame as they turned over. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford here, Light was another thing the tenements seemed determined to keep out. Many rooms had no windows at all, only a door that opened into a dim hallway. Even those with a window looked out onto another wall just a few feet away, blocking both sun and breeze. The air inside grew stagnant, carrying the dampness from the foundation all the way up to the top floor. The staircases were steep and narrow, their wooden steps worn smooth in the middle from countless feet. Some tilted to one side, as if the whole structure was leaning under its own weight. The banisters wobbled, the boards creaked, and the smell of cooking, cabbage, onions, bread gone slightly stale, drifted through every crack. At night, the sounds of the tenement came alive. A baby's thin cry from somewhere above, a muffled argument through the wall, the shuffle of tired feet returning home after a day of hard labor, and underneath it all, the faint scurrying of rats moving in the shadows between floors. In winter, the cold seeped in no matter how tightly the windows were shut, settling deep into the walls and the bones of those who lived there. Families huddled close around small stoves, burning whatever they could find. Wood scraps, old furniture, even coal stolen from the docks, just to take the edge off the frost. The heat never seemed to reach the far corners of the room. In summer, the air turned suffocating. With no ventilation, rooms became ovens, the plaster walls sweating moisture, the floorboards sticky underfoot. Children tossed and turned on thin mattresses, their hair damp, their faces flushed. Sometimes, it was cooler to sleep on the roof or even on the fire escapes if the building had them, though many did not. And fire was the great terror of the tenements. The same cramped design that allowed landlords to pack in so many tenants also meant that if flames took hold, they spread with terrifying speed. There were no safe exits, no real fire escapes, just narrow stairways that could quickly become blocked by smoke or collapsing beams. A single overturned lamp could set off a blaze that swallowed the whole building before anyone had a chance to flee. Still, the tenements were full. Every corner was taken, every attic and basement claimed. For the families who lived here, the tenement wasn't just a building. It was a fragile foothold in the city, a place to call home in a world that had given them little else. Within these walls, they ate their meals, told their stories, sang their lullabies. Life here was hard, but it was life all the same. In the years to come, these same cramped, breathless rooms would become breeding grounds for more than just hardship. They would also give rise to something far more dangerous, the spread of sickness that could sweep through the neighborhood in waves, leaving grief in its wake. And in 5 Points, that wave was always just around the corner. In 5 Points, danger didn't always come from the dark alleys or the shadowed corners. Sometimes, it came from within your own walls. The tenements were tinder boxes, thin wooden beams, dry floorboards, and flimsy partitions stacked floor upon floor, all held together with nails that had long since loosened. A single dropped lamp or overturned stove could turn a building into a roaring furnace in minutes. And when the flames came, there was nowhere to run. The stairways were narrow and steep, the hallways choked with furniture and laundry lines. Some tenements had no proper exits at all. Smoke would fill the upper floors in seconds, and panic would spread faster than the fire itself. Neighbors pounded on doors, children screamed, and the lucky ones stumbled into the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others never made it out. Whole families could be lost in a single night, their rooms reduced to glowing embers by morning. Even if the fire spared you, there were other threats waiting, quieter, but just as deadly. Disease moved through 5 Points like clockwork, returning year after year. Cholera, measles, diphtheria, typhus. Each found an easy home here. The crowded rooms, the stagnant air, the shared water pumps. All of it made perfect breeding grounds for sickness. One cough in the hallway could be heard on every floor by nightfall, and by the end of the week, half the building might be ill. The doctors who came rarely had much to offer, and for most families, medicine was too expensive to buy. The toll was heaviest on the children. In one small stretch of 5 Points known as the Bend, the numbers were staggering. In 1882, more than 2/3 of all recorded deaths there were children. 7 out of every 10 little lives, gone before they had a chance to grow. And yet, life went on. Mothers still rose before dawn to fetch water. Fathers still went to the docks or the factories, and the streets still filled with the sound of bare feet and quick laughter in the evening. Outside, the signs of sickness were everywhere if you knew how to see them. Pale faces peering from open windows. Buckets of soapy water sloshed down front steps in a feeble attempt to wash the germs away. Bundles wrapped in cloth, carried quietly down the street toward the undertaker, and through it all, the smell never left. In the summer heat, the gutters overflowed with a sluggish mix of rainwater, refuse, and sewage. Flies swarmed in the open markets. Merchants called out their wares in hoarse voices, selling bread, vegetables, and meat that had been sitting in the sun too long. A stale, sour scent clung to the air, a reminder that even on the brightest days, 5 Points was a place where life and death brushed against each other at every corner. For those who lived here, you learned not to flinch. You kept working, kept tending to your children, kept finding scraps of joy where you could. Because if you didn't, the weight of it all would press you down too far to rise again. In time, coping became second nature. And for some, the answer to the constant presence of sickness and loss was not to fight it, but to forget it, even for a little while. That forgetfulness came in many forms: laughter, music, or the warmth of a drink in hand as the lamps burned low. And in 5 Points, that drink was often stronger than milk. In 5 Points, there was an old saying whispered with a half smile and no real humor. If you live here, you drink whiskey instead of milk. It wasn't bravado, and it wasn't rebellion. It was simply the truth. The milk, when you could find it, was rarely safe. There were no refrigerated trucks, no careful inspections. Dairies outside the city would send their supply in on wagons or rail cars, the barrels sloshing in the heat. By the time it reached the crowded streets of 5 Points, it was already turning. Sometimes it was watered down to stretch the profit, other times laced with chalk or plaster dust to hide the sourness. Mothers would sniff it, frown, and pour it down the drain rather than risk their children's lives. Water was no better. The old collect pond, once clear enough to see the bottom, had been buried beneath tons of refuse. Every rainfall drew its foul memory back to the surface. The pumps scattered through the district pulled from wells that tasted of rust and decay. tinged with the invisible sickness of cholera or typhus. Even when boiled, the water carried a heaviness, a strange smell that clung to the cup, so people turned to what was, in its own way, safer: whiskey. Strong drink could be counted on not to spoil in the heat, and in a place where life was often short, the thought of long-term harm carried little weight. A glass of whiskey burned away the taste of the gutter air. It dulled the ache in tired bones, softened the edge of hunger, and, if only for a while, made the walls of the tenement seem farther apart. The saloons were everywhere. Some were little more than a single room behind a sagging door, the yellow glow of an oil lamp spilling out onto the crooked sidewalk. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the warm, sour smell of spilled beer. Men leaned over scarred wooden counters, their coins lined up like soldiers before them. They spoke in low voices or sang in loud ones. There was no hurry to leave. The night was always colder outside. Others were livelier, music drifting out into the street, the rhythmic tap of boots on bare floorboards. Here, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a currency of friendship, a ticket to forgetfulness. Neighbors bought rounds for one another, not because they were flush with money, but because generosity was one of the few luxuries they could afford. It was not uncommon to see women, too, sitting quietly in a corner with a small glass before them. Some came with their husbands, others on their own, their shawls wrapped tightly around their shoulders as they listened to the clatter of mugs and the occasional burst of laughter. For them, the saloon was a place of light, a break from the damp, narrow rooms where the walls sweated in summer and froze in winter. And then there were the children, not inside, not officially, but gathered just beyond the door, peeking through the crack to catch a glimpse of the brightness within. They were sent by parents with a few coins folded in their palms, told to bring back a jug wrapped in brown paper. They knew to hold it carefully, not to spill a drop. In 5 Points, whiskey was not a luxury. It was part of the rhythm of the place, as much as the sound of wagon wheels over cobblestone or the cry of the fishmonger in the morning. It was the salve for a hard day and the companion to a long night. And for many, it was the only thing that felt clean in a world thick with smoke, sewage, and sorrow. But not everyone accepted it as simply the way things were. Now and then, a stranger with a notebook or a man with a camera would stand at the edge of a saloon doorway, not to drink, but to watch. They saw more than just the glasses and the laughter. They saw the weariness in the eyes, the shadows on the faces when the music paused. One of those men was Jacob Riis, and where others saw only a place to pass through, he saw a place that needed to be shown to the rest of the world. The saloon doors swung closed behind you, and for a moment, the dim street outside felt almost quiet. The laughter, the clink of glasses, the sharp bite of whiskey, all of it faded into the muffled hum of the night. Here in 5 Points, the streets after dark were a patchwork of shadow and lamplight, of narrow alleys and crooked doorways, each hiding its own story. Most people walked quickly past. They kept their heads down, eyes fixed on the ground, eager to be somewhere else. But every so often, a stranger would stop, not to drink, not to gamble, not to look for trouble, but simply to watch, One of those strangers was Jacob Riis. He was not born to the wealth and comfort of the uptown neighborhoods. Riis knew something about hunger, about sleeping where you could, about the way a man's pride can shrink in the cold. He had crossed the Atlantic from Denmark with little more than hope, chasing the promise of America. But America, as he first found it, was not always the promise it had claimed to be. By the late 1880s, Riis had become a newspaperman, and in that work, he discovered his mission. He had seen enough suffering to know that words alone were sometimes too soft to stir the comfortable from their chairs. If he could show the public what these streets looked like, what life in the tenements truly meant, maybe, just maybe, they would have to care. And so he carried a new kind of weapon, a camera. Not the heavy studio kind that needed sunlight and patience, but a handheld tool paired with a harsh and startling invention, the flash. It was a burst of light so sudden, so bright, that for a heartbeat it seemed like daylight had cracked open in the middle of the night. For Riis, it was a way to pull back the curtain. He would step quietly into a narrow hallway, the air damp and close, and without warning, flash, the shadows were gone. Children in threadbare clothes huddled together on the floor. A family of 6 asleep in a room barely big enough for 2. Men in a lodging house, their faces hollow, their eyes reflecting that brief, blinding light. These images were not softened, not staged. They were raw, and they told the truth. When his photographs and stories were gathered into the book How the Other Half Lives in 1890, they were like a shock to the conscience of the city. For those who had never stepped foot in 5 Points, it was as though Riis had opened a hidden door and invited them inside. The polite parlors of uptown could no longer pretend ignorance. His work stirred debate, outrage, and, eventually, reform. Housing laws were challenged, building codes began to change, and the very shape of New York started to shift. It did not happen overnight, and the road from outrage to action was uneven. But Riis had done what few others could. He had made the unseen impossible to ignore, and yet, there was something else in his photographs, beyond the filth in the crowded rooms. If you looked closely, you could see it in the way a child smiled shyly at the camera, or the way neighbors leaned together in the doorway. It was resilience. Even in the darkest corners, there was a glimmer, the stubborn spark of life that refused to go out. Perhaps that is why Riis's work still speaks to us today. He did not photograph hopelessness. He photographed people, full of complexity, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to survive. As the years passed, the world of 5 Points continued to change. The faces in the photographs became the parents and grandparents of a new generation, and that generation would carry their own hopes, their own music, their own colors into the narrow streets, because 5 Points was never only a place of misery. It was also a place where different worlds collided, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in harmony. And out of that collision came something rare. A community unlike any other in America at the time. The flashbulbs of Jacob Riis's camera fade, and once again the streets are left in their natural state, dim, damp, and restless. Yet in the years after his work began to stir the conscience of the city, something remarkable unfolded in 5 Points. It was 1827 when New York State abolished slavery, and in the quiet ripple that followed, newly freed African Americans began to find their way into the neighborhood. They came for the same reason so many others did, because the rents were low, and because even in its poverty, 5 Points offered a kind of space to breathe that other parts of the city would not. Here, among the sagging tenements and uneven cobblestones, they could begin to build lives of their own. By the 1840s, the next great wave arrived, the Irish. Driven from their homeland by famine and political unrest, they poured into the city by the thousands. Many stepped off the ships with little more than the clothes they wore, speaking with accents that set them apart instantly. 5 Points was one of the few places that would take them in. It was not a welcome free of hardship. The work was grueling, the pay meager, and the prejudice from the established city was sharp. But within the crooked walls of the neighborhood, they could find others who understood that same ache of starting over. Not long after came the Italians, carrying with them the music, the food, and the warmth of the old country. They set up small groceries and bakeries, their windows clouded with the scent of fresh bread and coffee. In the summer, doors stood open to let the air in, and the sound of familiar songs would drift down into the street. 5 Points, for all its dangers, became something rare for its time. A place where Black, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Chinese immigrants might share the same block, the same courtyard, sometimes even the same cramped tenement floor. In most of America, these communities would be separated not just by distance, but by law and custom. Here, necessity forced them together. It was not an easy coexistence. There were moments of deep camaraderie, a neighbor offering bread to another's hungry child, or a street band made up of players from 2 continents. But there were also moments when the air seemed to crackle with mistrust. Old world rivalries and new world prejudices collided in the narrow alleys, and a misunderstanding could spill into a fight before the sun had set. And yet, in spite of that tension, something new began to take root. Children grew up speaking a patchwork of languages, picking up bits of each other's games, each other's songs. They learned to dance in rhythms that didn't belong to any one country, and to cook meals that blended flavors from many kitchens. They carried with them the stubborn hope that life here, no matter how hard, might be better than the life they had left behind. From a distance, outsiders often saw only the crime, the grime, and the chaos. But within the neighborhood itself, there were bonds being formed, invisible threads that tied families together across culture and color. In back rooms of small taverns, men from different backgrounds would sit shoulder to shoulder, passing the same bottle and talking about the price of bread, the cost of rent, and the rumors of work down by the docks. In the marketplace, a woman from County Cork might trade a loaf of soda bread for a handful of spices from a Caribbean stall, both of them laughing in a language neither spoke fluently, but somehow understood. This was the heartbeat of 5 Points. Irregular, sometimes strained, but alive. It was a neighborhood defined as much by its clashes as by its unlikely friendships, a living proof that cultures could meet not only in conflict, but in creation. And it was in that meeting, in the sound of a fiddle answering a drum, in the mingling smells of bread and stew and roasted meat, in the sight of children skipping rope under laundry lines heavy with clothes from a dozen homelands, that something beautiful began to happen. A culture was forming here, one that belonged to no single place, and yet belonged to all who called these streets home. And it would spill out into the open air, filling the markets, the dance halls, and the very rhythm of the streets, because in 5 Points, life was not lived behind closed doors. It was lived where everyone could see, where the music and the voices could mingle without asking permission. And that is where we'll go next, into the markets and music, into the sights and sounds of streets alive with culture. The nights in 5 Points could be dangerous, yes, but they could also be alive in a way no polished boulevard of uptown New York could ever be. From the cramped tenements and shadowed alleys spilled the heartbeat of a dozen homelands, carried in song, scent, and laughter. By day, the streets were crowded with carts and makeshift stalls. Wooden wheels creaked over uneven cobblestones. Women in worn shawls called out the day's offerings, fresh rolls still warm from the oven, turnips with the dirt of nearby farms still clinging to their roots, salted fish laid out on rough boards. The air was a mixture of smells that shouldn't have belonged together. Freshly baked bread drifting past the tang of pickled cabbage, the earthy sharpness of onions mingling with the sweet comfort of roasted chestnuts. It was overwhelming to the senses, but to those who lived here, it was the perfume of survival. On the corner, a street fiddler, an Irishman with a weathered face and a quick grin, played a lively jig that seemed to make the cobblestones dance. A few feet away, an African drummer answered him, palms striking the taut skin of the drum in a rhythm that rolled like a heartbeat. It was music without a conductor, yet perfectly in time. Two traditions that might have never met anywhere else in the world, here weaving into something new. Children darted through the crowd, their bare feet nimble over the stones. They carried baskets nearly too heavy for their small frames, delivering bread for a baker or laundry for a seamstress. Yet even in their hurry, they found moments to pause, drawn to the music, to the smell of frying dough dusted with sugar, to the bright chatter of languages they didn't yet fully understand, but were already learning to call their own. At night, lanterns were strung across certain blocks, casting a warm golden glow that softened the hard edges of the place. The market became more than just a place to buy and sell. It became a gathering ground. Italian vendors roasted sausages over open coals, their sizzle mingling with the voices of German beer sellers calling for customers. Women in bright Caribbean scarves balanced trays of pastries on their heads, their laughter ringing out over the clamor. It was a tapestry of humanity stitched together in the narrow space between buildings. If you stood still long enough, you could hear the city breathing here. One long, slow inhale of shared existence. There were quarrels, of course, elbows bumping, tempers flaring over the price of apples or the space to hang a fishnet. But there was also the quiet rhythm of community life. A mother pressing a coin into her son's hand for a rare, sweet bun. Neighbors stopping to exchange gossip in the middle of the street, oblivious to the wagons inching past. To an outsider from the well-paved avenues uptown, it might have looked like chaos. But to those who belonged here, the streets of 5 Points were alive in the truest sense. Messy, noisy, colorful, and endlessly adapting. These stalls and sidewalks were the meeting place of worlds, old traditions carried from across the sea, colliding and blending into something new that would, in time, help define the city itself. And beneath the noise, there was resilience. Every melody, every shouted bargain, every loaf of bread pulled fresh from the oven was an act of persistence, proof that even in a place the rest of the city dismissed as hopeless, life could be rich and full. It was in these streets, among the carts and music, that cultures met not just in words, but in rhythm and movement. This was where a new kind of expression began to take root, where the tap of a shoe on stone kept time with the beat of a drum. And soon, that rhythm would carry us into something entirely new. A dance born here in the heart of 5 Points, where the jig and the drum would meet under the same lantern light. The rhythm had been building for years in the streets of 5 Points. You could hear it in the market stalls, in the shuffle of boots over the cobblestones, in the laughter that spilled out of dimly lit saloons. It was the sound of cultures living side by side, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, always moving to the beat of survival. By the late 1830s, something extraordinary began to happen. On one side of the street, an Irish fiddler would strike up a jig, his bow flying quick and light across the strings. Across from him, a black drummer would answer, his hands finding a heartbeat on stretched skin that no sheet music could capture. It wasn't just music, it was conversation. Back and forth, note for beat, beat for note. Children gathered to watch, their eyes wide, their bodies swaying unconsciously to this strange and wonderful union of sound. At first, it was just the music. Then, slowly, the feet joined in. The Irish brought their quick percussive steps, heel and toe, a light bounce, the sharp click of nails driven into shoe soles for extra snap. The African tradition added fluidity, improvisation, and a grounded power that came from deep in the hips and knees. When the two met, something new was born. Not quite one, not quite the other, but a third thing entirely. A dance that could speak without words, that could tell a story in rhythm alone. One name rose from this fertile ground, Master Juba, born William Henry Lane. A young black man with an almost supernatural sense of timing, Juba could mimic the Irish steps perfectly, then twist them into something entirely his own, lighter, quicker, richer in syncopation. His feet could play 2 rhythms at once, one for each ear, weaving them together so that the floor seemed to sing beneath him. Word spread quickly. People who had never set foot in 5 Points came to see him perform. Some found their way to Almac's dance hall, a place with smoky oil lamps casting long shadows against the wooden walls, where the air was thick with pipe smoke and the scent of spilled beer. The floorboards themselves seemed alive, humming under the feet of dancers who chased the music until sweat shone on their brows. Inside, Juba would take his place at the center. The fiddler would start slow, almost teasing, and Juba's feet would answer in gentle taps like rain on a tin roof. Then the drummer would lean in, adding a steady pulse, and the tempo would quicken. The crowd, dock workers, seamstresses, sailors on shore leave, would clap along, the rhythm contagious. Sometimes you'd see an Irish dancer challenge him, 2 men facing off, grinning, the fiddler's bow flying faster with every pass. Juba would match him step for step, then slip in an unexpected beat, a little shuffle from the African tradition, turning the contest into a duet. By the end, they'd be laughing, breathless, their shoes smoking from the effort. It was more than entertainment. In a neighborhood where poverty, disease, and gang violence pressed in from every side, these moments of music and movement were a kind of defiance. The dance said, "We are still here. We can still create beauty. We can still make something new together." And this something new didn't stay in 5 points. The steps traveled, carried by dancers and musicians to theaters, to traveling shows, to the vaudeville stage. It would become America's first truly original dance form, what the world would one day call tap dance. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it still. The scrape of a shoe, the staccato burst of a heel drop, the answering thump of a drum. It's the sound of two cultures meeting in rhythm instead of in conflict. The sound of a city, for one brief moment, in harmony. And yet, just beyond the dance hall's warm glow, the shadows were lengthening in the alleyways. The same streets that gave birth to this joyous music would soon echo with a different kind of beat. The hard stamp of boots, the rallying cries of men bound not by art, but by violence. That story, too, began here, in the alleys of 5 Points. By now, the streets of 5 Points had learned to live with noise. There was always the rattle of wagon wheels, the shouts of vendors, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But as the sun went down and the market stalls were packed away, a different sound began to echo through the narrow lanes. Boots on wet cobblestones, low voices in hurried conversation, and sometimes the unmistakable rhythm of many feet moving together. This was the hour when the alleys belonged to the gangs. They didn't appear all at once. In the beginning, the groups were small, almost harmless. Bands of young men who had grown up in the same block, sharing the same hardships, speaking the same tongue. For the Irish immigrants, there were the Roach Guards, their name taken from a military regiment back home, though their uniform was little more than a ragged coat and a flat cap. They stood watch at the corners, ready to defend their neighbors against anyone who came looking for trouble. Then there were the Dead Rabbits, fierce and quick to fight, who carried a crude banner, a single dead rabbit nailed to a stick. The sight alone was enough to make a rival gang think twice before crossing them. And of course, there were the Bowery Boys, proud of their American birth, quick with a fist, and quicker with an insult toward any foreigner who dared claim a foothold in their city. At first, these groups were a kind of rough protection. In a place where the police rarely ventured, they filled the gap, escorting women home at night, standing guard over a shop after closing. But protection came with a cost, and before long, loyalty was enforced not just by friendship, but by fear. The line between defending your own and picking a fight grew thinner with each passing year. On summer nights, you could feel the tension rising with the heat. A shouted insult from one side of the street, an answering challenge from the other, and suddenly a dozen men would spill into the road, sticks and clubs in hand, their boots splashing through the shallow puddles left by an afternoon rain. They fought for pride, for territory, for the right to walk a street without lowering their eyes, The gangs marked their presence in ways that went beyond bruises and broken windows. A scrap of cloth tied to a lamppost, chalk symbols scrawled at the base of a stairwell. They were warnings and invitations, both signs that this was claimed ground, and you were either part of it or you were not welcome. In the dim gaslight, their silhouettes stretched long and thin against the brick walls. A tilted hat, the outline of a club resting on a shoulder, the quick flash of a knife when a coat shifted. Even at a distance, you could sense the energy. Restless, coiled, waiting for an excuse. To live here was to know them by sight, to know when to cross the street or when to duck into a doorway until the noise passed. Mothers warned their sons not to linger too long on the steps after dark, not to let their eyes meet the wrong ones. Yet for many young men, the gangs were not something to avoid. They were a promise of belonging in a city that often refused to claim them. And so the gangs grew, not just in number, but in purpose. They began to take on names that carried weight beyond 5 points, names spoken in taverns uptown and whispered in police stations. The small bands that once stood for neighborhood pride were hardening into something more organized, more dangerous. The shadows in the alley were no longer just the absence of light. They were the presence of power. And as we step deeper into the streets, that power will grow. The first gangs are only the beginning. Soon, the city will see riots that shake its foundations, and the name 5 Points will be shouted not just here, but across New York, sometimes in fear, sometimes in defiance, but always with the weight of everything this place had become. By the late 1850s, the gangs of 5 Points had grown far beyond the restless bands of boys they once were. Their loyalties had hardened into territory lines, boundaries not marked on any city map, but understood by every man who dared to cross them. These invisible borders ran down crooked streets and narrow alleys, through markets and past tenements, slicing the neighborhood into pieces claimed by names that carried both pride and menace. It was a fragile balance, one that could be tipped by a careless glance, a drunken insult, or the echo of a club striking the wrong shoulder. The most infamous of these eruptions came in the summer of 1857. It began with a small confrontation, as so many of these battles did, between the Dead Rabbits and their bitter rivals, the Bowery Boys. But this time, the spark fell onto dry timber. Within hours, the alleys swelled with men armed with clubs, brick bats, and the occasional pistol. Windows shattered, doors splintered, and the cobblestones themselves seemed to tremble under the stampede of boots. For 2 days, 48 hours that felt like a lifetime, the neighborhood was consumed by the Dead Rabbits riot. Shopkeepers shuttered their doors, families huddled in the back rooms of their tenements, listening to the crash of furniture overturned in the street. Smoke hung low over the rooftops, and the air reeked of sweat, gunpowder, and fear. The police, undermanned and outnumbered, struggled to keep up, charging one street only to see another break out in chaos behind them. When it was over, the streets lay strewn with broken glass and splintered wood, the colors of each gang smeared in the mud. The fragile balance was gone, replaced by a rawer truth. 5 Points was a place where disputes could swell into war, and war could come at any time. But the bloodiest riot was yet to come. In the sweltering summer of 1863, the city was already on edge. The Civil War raged far to the south, but its shadow fell heavily on New York. News of the federal draft swept through the streets, calling for men to fight, but allowing the wealthy to buy their way out for $300. In 5 points, where $300 might as well have been $3 million, the injustice felt like a slap in the face. On July 13th, anger turned to fury. Crowds gathered, voices rising into shouts, shouts hardening into action. They surged through the streets, pulling down telegraph poles, smashing windows, setting fire to buildings. The draft riots had begun. For 4 days, the city burned. The violence was not only against the draft, it spilled into ugly, targeted attacks on Black New Yorkers, many of whom had lived and worked in 5 Points for years. Their homes and businesses were looted, their lives torn apart by neighbors they had once greeted in the marketplace. Soldiers marched in from the battlefields to put down the unrest, their bayonets glinting in the smoke-hazed light. By the time order returned, more than 100 lay dead, hundreds more wounded, and vast swaths of the city smoldered in ruin. Those who survived spoke of the sound most, the way the city seemed to roar during those days. The roar of 1,000 angry voices, the crackle of flames devouring wood, the heavy boots of soldiers pounding against the cobblestones. It was the sound of a city tearing at its own seams, and yet, when the smoke cleared, 5 Points still stood. Its streets were scarred, its people hardened, but life crept back in, as it always did. Children played again in the gutters. Vendors reopened their stalls. But the riots had left a mark that could not be swept away. A deeper sense that this place was both fiercely alive and always on the brink of violence. From these ashes, something new began to take shape. The loose street crews and neighborhood factions that had once clashed over corners and pride started to see the value of unity, at least among themselves. It was from this realization that one of the most notorious organizations in New York's history would rise. And that is where our story turns next, to the man who would take the chaos of 5 Points and mold it into an empire, the first true crime syndicate of the city. When the smoke of the riots finally drifted away and the broken glass was swept from the streets, 5 Points seemed, for a moment, to exhale. The shouting had stopped, the soldiers had gone, and the night air no longer rang with the crack of gunfire. But in the uneasy quiet that followed, something else began to take root. The gangs that had once fought over alleys and corners started to see that there was more to be gained from unity than endless street battles. They learned, slowly, and often through uneasy truces, that a man who could gather fighters under a single banner could control not just a block, but an entire neighborhood. Into this shifting world stepped a man who would change the face of organized crime in New York. Paul Kelly. Born Paolo Vaccarelli in Italy, Kelly came to America as a young immigrant, with the dark hair, sharp suits, and polished manners that set him apart from the rough street fighters around him. He spoke not just Italian, but English and French, moving easily between the immigrant crowds and the city's political elite. In a place where most men's power ended at the edge of their turf, Kelly's influence reached into City Hall. Kelly understood something the older gangs had never quite mastered: organization. Where the Dead Rabbits or Bowery Boys had relied on brute strength and reputation, Kelly built his gang like a business. He trained his men to fight in the ring and to walk in step. He set rules, collected dues, and made alliances that stretched beyond the narrow, muddy lanes of 5 Points. The 5 Points gang, under Kelly's leadership, became a force unlike any before it. Its membership swelled with young men from Italy, Ireland, and the Jewish neighborhoods nearby. Men who had once been enemies, but now found themselves brothers in a new kind of order. And Kelly, always the strategist, saw opportunity in the city's politics. In Tammany Hall, the powerful democratic machine that ran New York, he found partners who needed muscle at election time. His men would make sure the right ballots were cast and the wrong ones never made it to the box. In return, the gang enjoyed protection from the law, contracts, and the quiet nods of those in power. It was a dangerous kind of marriage, politics and crime bound together. But it worked. The gang's reach extended from the crowded saloons of Mulberry Street to the marble steps of city offices. They ran gambling halls, protected businesses, and made sure no rival gang could threaten their territory. Among Kelly's ranks were young men who would go on to become legends in their own right, names that would echo far beyond the borders of 5 Points. Al Capone, who started as a teenage bouncer for Kelly before making his mark in Chicago. Lucky Luciano, who would help shape the modern American mafia. Each learned in these streets that loyalty, discipline, and patience could build empires. In many ways, Kelly was as much a showman as a crime boss. He dressed in tailored suits, spoke politely to reporters, and carried himself like a gentleman. To the public, he was a boxing promoter and a businessman. To his men, he was the one who turned the chaos of the alleys into a well-oiled machine. But beneath the polish, the gang's work was still soaked in violence. Debts were collected with fists, or worse. Rivals disappeared. And those who crossed the 5 Points gang rarely had the chance to do it twice. Still, for a time, Kelly's empire seemed untouchable, a perfect blend of street power and political connection. The neighborhood that had once been a patchwork of warring factions was now under the shadow of a single, disciplined force. And yet, power in 5 Points was never permanent. Every alliance carried the seeds of betrayal. Every favor had its cost. As the gang's influence grew, so did the tension between the world of politics and the world of crime, a tension that would soon test even Kelly's skill. From here, our story turns to that uneasy balance and the dangerous alliance between crime and politics that would define the next chapter of 5 Points history. In the wake of Paul Kelly's rise, 5 Points no longer belonged solely to the shadows. It had found a way, subtle and dangerous, to step into the light of City Hall without ever leaving the alleys behind. Kelly understood what few gang leaders before him had grasped, that power on the streets was fleeting, but power tied to politics could last for years. On election days, the gang's presence was felt on every corner. Men in dark coats leaned against lampposts, watching who came and went. At polling stations, ballots were guided into the right hands. Those who hesitated were met with a quiet word, a firm hand on the shoulder, and, if needed, the sudden appearance of 3 or 4 more men who made persuasion unnecessary. Sometimes it was subtler still. Voters handed a pre-marked ballot before they even entered. Other times, Entire blocks were encouraged to stay home if their loyalties leaned the wrong way. It was democracy draped in the heavy fabric of fear. In return for these services, Tammany Hall, the city's great political machine, offered the gangs something no street war could ever secure: protection. Police who once raided saloons now looked the other way. Licenses appeared where they were needed. Arrests, when they happened at all, dissolved before they ever reached a judge. Money, of course, flowed in both directions. Kickbacks from gambling halls and brothels fed campaign funds. Political connections brought contracts, permits, and the kind of quiet legitimacy that allowed Kelly's operations to spread far beyond 5 Points. It was a marriage of convenience, crime lending muscle to politics, politics lending cover to crime. For the residents of the neighborhood, the line between government and gang blurred until it all seemed part of the same unshakable structure. The man who fixed your leaking roof might be the same man who collected protection fees. The face you saw handing out turkeys at Christmas might also be the one who blocked your neighbor from voting last spring. There was a strange rhythm to it, almost like an understanding. The politicians got their votes, the gangs got their power, and the people got whatever scraps of order could be maintained in a place where law came dressed in many faces. But beneath the surface, this alliance carried an unspoken truth. Neither side truly trusted the other. Politics thrived on the shifting winds of public opinion. Gangs thrived on loyalty and fear. One misstep, one betrayal, and the balance could shatter overnight. And yet, for a time, it held. 5 Points was no longer just a slum. It was a cog in the great, humming machinery of New York City's politics. The muddy streets that had once been ignored by the city's elite were now a place where power was cultivated, traded, and used with precision. It was an era when a handshake in a back room could shape an entire election, and when the same hand might, hours later, close into a fist. Still, the alliance could not shield 5 Points from another kind of attention, one that would come not from ballots or backroom deals, but from curious eyes looking in from the outside. The wealthy, the reformers, the writers, people who had never set foot in these streets before, would soon arrive to see for themselves this infamous neighborhood where politics and crime shared the same breath, and with them would come a new kind of spectacle, one that turned the misery of 5 Points into something to be toured, written about, and judged. That is where our story now turns. The uneasy alliance between politics and crime had made 5 Points a place of influence, but also of notoriety. Word of its lawless streets and restless nights drifted far beyond New York, and soon the neighborhood's reputation began drawing a different sort of visitor, not the immigrant seeking a foothold, not the policeman sent to keep the peace, but the curious, those with means, leisure, and a taste for the strange. They came in carriages from uptown, their boots polished, their gloves clean, stepping carefully into streets where the mud clung thick and the air held a sour weight. For them, 5 Points was a spectacle, an exhibit, a place to peer at poverty from the safety of daylight hours, like looking into an aquarium where the creatures inside could never reach them. Guides, sometimes locals seeking a few coins, would lead them down the crooked lanes, past leaning tenements, and the smells that seemed to seep from the very ground. By the mid-19th century, this slumming had become something of a fad. Society ladies and gentlemen, in pressed suits and silk dresses, would pick their way past barefoot children, noting the ragged laundry strung between windows like flags of surrender. They whispered to each other as they passed tavern doors, peeking in at the dim oil lamps and shadowed faces, perhaps secretly relieved to step back into the sunlight. Even famous eyes came to see it. In 1842, Charles Dickens, touring America, walked these same streets. He wrote of his visit in American Notes, describing the tangle of alleys, the reek of rot and whiskey, the faces worn before their years. His words were sharp, almost surgical, laying bare the misery he witnessed. Yet there was also a kind of fascination in his tone, as if he knew this place would stay with him long after he left. For the people who lived here, the intrusion was complicated. Some saw opportunity, selling drinks, trinkets, or stories to those who wanted a taste of danger without real risk. Others resented it deeply. To be stared at like an oddity, to have one's hardship reduced to an evening's entertainment. It was another wound layered atop so many others. The irony was hard to miss. Many of the same politicians who benefited from 5 Points muscle, many of the same wealthy citizens whose industries had poisoned the pond and driven the poor into these crumbling buildings, now came to gawk at the results. It was as if the city wanted to keep its underbelly on display, just close enough to marvel at, never close enough to touch. And yet, these visits had a strange effect. For some, the shock of what they saw stayed with them, planting the seed for reform. For others, it hardened their prejudices, confirming every story they'd heard about the dangerous classes. Either way, 5 Points became not just a neighborhood, but a symbol, a living, breathing argument about what a city owed its poorest citizens. As the century wore on, the gawkers would keep coming, even as the gang wars cooled and the political deals shifted elsewhere. But the eyes upon 5 Points were beginning to change. Among the tourists now were reformers, photographers, and city planners. They weren't here for thrills alone. They had the means, and sometimes the will, to remake this place entirely. And so, with the same swiftness that it had once risen from a drained pond, 5 Points would find itself facing another transformation. This time, not from within, but from forces determined to erase it from the map. The gawkers had come and gone. The gangs had risen and fallen, and yet the name 5 Points still carried a weight, spoken with either a shake of the head or a quiet note of awe. By the late 19th century, the city's patience with this corner of New York had worn thin. For decades, reformers had campaigned for change, armed with photographs, pamphlets, and speeches that painted 5 Points as a blight on the city's conscience. To the powerful, it was not just a neighborhood. It was an embarrassment, a living reminder that in the shadow of grand banks and marble halls, people still lived in damp, dark rooms, still drew water from pumps that smelled of rot, and so, in 1892, the decision was made. The tenements would come down, not patched, not repaired, erased. The process was as deliberate as it was final. Street by street, the wooden stairs where children had played were dismantled. The sagging brick walls that had leaned against each other for strength were knocked apart. The air, once thick with the mingled scents of bread ovens and refuse, filled instead with the acrid bite of dust. For some, it was a welcome sight, the end of what they called a stain on the city. For others, especially those whose entire lives had been lived within these narrow blocks, it was a kind of death. In place of the cramped rooms and twisting alleys came something altogether new: open space. Where laundry had once fluttered overhead, fresh grass began to grow. The city called it Columbus Park, a place for children to run without fear of falling into an open sewer, for neighbors to gather in sunlight instead of shadows. Nearby, Seward Park followed, offering benches beneath young trees and the promise of fresh air. On the maps, the transformation was swift. Street names were altered, intersections redrawn, boundaries blurred. What had once been known in newspapers across the country as the most notorious neighborhood in America began to vanish, not just in brick and mortar, but in memory. It was as if the city believed that by renaming, by replacing, it could rewrite the story entirely. But for those who had walked those streets in their youth, no new park could erase the sound of tin cups clinking in a tavern, or the sight of a mother rocking her baby by a smoky lamp. They carried those images with them, even as the landmarks disappeared. Sometimes they would pass through the new parks and, without meaning to, find themselves standing exactly where their childhood home had been. Only now there was grass underfoot, and the wind moved freely where once the air had stood heavy and still. The erasure was not just physical. Over the years, the city's history books spoke less and less of 5 points. Children in nearby schools learned about the Revolutionary War, about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, but not about the neighborhood that had once pulsed just blocks away. It became the kind of story told in kitchens late at night, or murmured between old friends when the conversation drifted toward how things used to be. And yet, erasing something from the skyline does not erase it from the soul of a city. The struggles and triumphs of 5 points, the music that was born there, the mingling of cultures, the sheer will to survive in the face of squalor, had already seeped into New York's foundation. The parks and new buildings stood as proof of change, but under the grass, the soil still held the memories. As the century turned, those who had once feared 5 points began to walk freely where it had been. Children chased each other across the open lawns, never knowing the battles fought under their feet. Tourists took photographs of the neat pathways and shade trees, unaware that they were standing on the crossroads of a history both infamous and extraordinary. And yet, sometimes, when the light slanted just right and the hum of the city grew faint, an old-timer might pause in the middle of the park, close their eyes, and hear it again. The distant echo of a fiddle, the clatter of boots on cobblestones, the low rumble of a city learning how to grow by first tearing something down. The neighborhood was gone. The name was fading. But as time would prove, 5 points was not so easily forgotten. For more than a century, the name 5 points seemed to fade into the shadows of memory. It lived mostly in the yellowed pages of history books, in the grainy photographs of Jacob Riis, and in the whispered recollections of families who had once called those crooked streets home. The city had built parks and new buildings over its footprint, had redrawn its map, and, perhaps most effectively, had stopped speaking the name aloud. And yet, Some names are not so easily buried. They linger, like an echo in the corners of a room long after the music has stopped. They slip into conversation when old neighbors meet, or when a grandson asks his grandfather why he moved to Brooklyn all those years ago. Sometimes the name is spoken with pride of a community that endured. Other times it is said with a shiver, recalling hardship and danger. But it is spoken. It survives. Then, in 2021, something quietly remarkable happened. At the intersection of Worth Street and Baxter Street, where once the beating heart of 5 Points had pulsed with life and later with silence, the city placed a new sign. It was simple, green and white like any other, but its letters carried the weight of an entire vanished neighborhood. 5 Points. It was not an attempt to rebuild what had been lost. There were no false storefronts or recreations of narrow alleys, no return to the mud and shadow. It was instead a gesture of remembrance, a nod to the truth that no matter how a city changes, it should not forget the ground it was built on. That sign did not erase the parks or the modern apartment buildings. It did not bring back the sounds of fiddles or the clatter of boots on cobblestones, but it invited passers-by to pause, even if only for a moment, and wonder, what happened here? It bridged the present to the past, offering the curious a chance to pull at the threads of history and discover the people, immigrants, laborers, children, who once filled these streets with their voices. For those who knew the story, seeing that sign was like hearing a familiar melody after years of silence. It stirred memories of photographs in museum exhibits, of stories told late at night in living rooms, of pages in well-worn books about the underbelly of old New York. It was proof that the city, in its own way, could acknowledge both its darkest corners and the resilience that grew within them. The naming was not just about honoring a place. It was about honoring the people who lived there, the mothers who carried water up 3 flights of stairs, the fathers who rose before dawn to find work, the children who played in streets their parents feared. It was about recognizing that history is not always neat or noble, but it is always worth remembering. And so, even in a city that reinvents itself constantly, the name 5 Points has found its way back onto the map. Small, perhaps, but unshakable. It stands now in daylight, visible to everyone, where for so long it was spoken only in the margins. From this point forward, when someone walks past that corner and looks up at the sign, they might carry the name with them. They might look it up later, or ask someone older what it means. And in that question, in that curiosity, the echo grows louder, because history's power lies not just in what it was, but in what it continues to stir within us. 5 Points was once a cautionary tale, then a fading rumor. Now, it is a remembered name, one that warns, teaches, and reminds all at once. And as the city moves on, the lesson remains, ready to be heard by those willing to stop, listen, and let the past speak. The new street sign at Worth and Baxter might seem like a small thing, just a name on metal, bolted high above the sidewalk. But for those who know the story, it's more than an address. It's a mirror, reflecting back both the hardship and the humanity that once lived here. 5 Points is no longer the maze of leaning tenements muddy alleys, and restless crowds it was a century ago. But its lessons still breathe between the bricks of this city. They are reminders whispered in the hum of subway tracks, in the stubborn weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement, in the layered histories of every neighborhood that has risen and fallen here. The first lesson is one cities learn over and over again. Neglect has a cost. The tale of 5 Points began not with gangs or crime, but with something much quieter: poor planning, and the decision to build over a poisoned foundation. When Collect Pond was filled with refuse instead of clean soil, the rot began. It took decades for the consequences to unfold, but by the time the city realized the depth of the damage, generations had already been shaped by it. You cannot simply cover over a problem and expect it to disappear. It festers. It waits. The second lesson is about the resilience of people. 5 Points was infamous, yes, but it was also alive with music, dance, and culture that could not be erased by hardship. Here, the Irish jig found the African drumbeat and created something entirely new. Here, neighbors from different worlds learned to share food, stories, and song. Even in the shadows, the human spirit found a way to light its own small candles. It's a truth as old as time. Even in the poorest corners, joy will fight for a place to live. The third lesson may be the most uncomfortable. Power will often look the other way, until it is forced not to. 5 Points existed for decades in plain sight. Reform came not because the city suddenly cared, but because the voices of journalists, reformers, and ordinary citizens grew too loud to ignore. Change requires someone to keep speaking, even when the world grows tired of listening. If no one demands better, the neglect continues. And finally, perhaps the most personal lesson: memory matters. Without it, places like 5 Points vanish completely, not just from maps, but from the conscience of a city. The past becomes a ghost without a name, drifting unrecognized through the streets it once claimed. By naming that corner again in 2021, the city quietly admitted that erasing a place does not erase its story. It is a reminder that remembering is a form of respect, and sometimes a form of justice. Today, tourists walk safely where the old gangs once roamed. Children play in Columbus Park where once the alleys were thick with smoke and fear. Most will never know the depth of struggle beneath their feet, but if they pause, just for a moment, to read that sign and ask why, the door opens to all of this history. It's an invitation to learn and perhaps to carry those lessons into how we treat the vulnerable in our own time. Because 5 Points is not just a story about the past, it's a warning about the present. Every great city has its shadows. The question is whether we choose to look at them or pretend they are not there. And so, as the light of modern New York spills over the quiet lawns of the park, the echoes remain. They are not here to frighten, but to remind that beneath the towers and bright avenues, there was once mud and music, suffering and survival, and that both are worth remembering. From here, the story begins to soften. We step away from the noise of history's battles and into the gentler truth that even in a place once defined by hardship, beauty still bloomed. And in the closing moments of this journey, we will linger with that thought, letting the sound of tap shoes on cobblestones and the laughter of children guide us from the shadows into the light. The echoes of 5 Points linger, even as the city above it has long since moved on. It would be easy to end the story in the shadows, among the damp bricks, the narrow alleys, and the weight of all that went wrong here. But 5 Points was never just a place of suffering. It was also a place of transformation. If you close your eyes, you can almost see the change begin. The smoke from the riots clears. The old tenements come down, brick by brick, until only open sky hangs above the ground that once sagged under the weight of too many lives crammed into too little space. Fresh air moves in where there had only been the smell of rot. The light, for the first time in a long time, is unobstructed, and yet something of the old life remains. Not the violence or the despair, but the music, the rhythm, the quiet strength of those who, even in the hardest times, found a way to create beauty. The tap of a shoe against a wooden floor, the soft scrape of a fiddle bow, the hum of a song that belonged to no single culture, but to all who called this place home. From the mud of 5 Points, music rose like a stubborn flower, pushing through broken stone. You can trace it in the syncopated steps of tap dancers who carried those rhythms into theaters and dance halls far from here. You can hear it in jazz, in vaudeville, in the heartbeat of American music that still carries echoes of this corner of Manhattan. And you can feel it too, in the way art often grows best where life has been hardest. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the city was reshaping the land. Columbus Park replaced the Bend, turning a place once known for darkness into a patch of green where children could run. Families strolled where once they hurried with their heads down. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts and sweet pastries in the open air, their voices calling out not from the shadows but under the sun. Even the name 5 Points, once whispered with fear, began to soften over time, becoming part of a shared history rather than a current wound. Some who had lived through its worst years carried their memories quietly, perhaps not wishing to tell their children the full story, but others remembered with a kind of hard-earned pride. Yes, it had been dangerous. Yes, it had been poor. But it had also been theirs, and it had given rise to a culture and a resilience no one could take away. In that way, 5 Points is like many places that have faced hardship. When the dirt is washed away and the streets are repaved, the past doesn't vanish. It settles deep into the foundation, shaping what comes next. You can build something new, but if you listen closely enough, you can still hear what was here before, and perhaps that is the final transformation. From mud to music, from fear to laughter, from a place people tried to erase to a story people choose to remember. Tonight, as we leave 5 Points, the image we carry is not the dim oil lamps over narrow stairwells, nor the gang fights in the streets. Instead, it is a warm evening in the park that stands there now. The grass glows in the golden light before sunset. Somewhere, a busker plays a tune that dances between Irish steps and African beats, the two threads woven together so tightly you can't separate them. Children clap along, their shoes tapping against the pavement, unknowing heirs to a rhythm born long before they arrived. History has a way of holding both truths at once, that a place can be broken, and it can also give rise to beauty. And if we can hold those truths too, then perhaps the lessons of 5 Points will not fade. Soon, we'll slow our steps even more, letting the story's final notes carry us toward rest. We'll let the music linger, soft, steady, and sure, until it fades into the quiet. Because from the mud, the music always finds its way home. The music still lingers in the air, soft and unhurried. It drifts upward from the park that now stands where mud once swallowed boots and hope alike. It is late now, later than you realize, and the city's daytime rush has long since faded into a quieter rhythm. The lights glow like a scattering of warm embers, each window a little hearth in the great expanse of night. We have walked together through shadows tonight, through narrow alleys and cramped rooms where light once struggled to survive. We've stood in the thick of a crowd at a street corner, heard the sharp tap of leather soles on worn wood, and felt the tension of a city that could be both neighborly and dangerous in the same breath. We have seen the rise and fall of gangs, the cries of protest, the stubborn pulse of culture that refused to be extinguished. And now, we stand at the edge of it all, looking back at a place that was once the beating, if troubled, heart of old New York. It's strange, isn't it, how time changes the edges of a story. When it is happening, the streets are loud, the struggles are raw, the dangers feel permanent. But with the passing of years, the sharp lines soften, the anger fades into memory, the pain settles into the earth, and what remains is something gentler. We remember the songs more than the shouts, the laughter more than the blows. It is not that the darkness disappears, but that it no longer owns the whole picture. In that way, 5 Points is like so many places we've visited together. It is a reminder that even the harshest corners of the world can give rise to something enduring, something worth carrying forward. From the mud came music. From the crowded tenements came stories that still ripple outward. From the mix of cultures, Irish, African, Italian, and more, came a shared rhythm that would seep into the foundation of American art, dance, and song. As the night deepens, the park grows quiet. A last group of friends drifts toward the subway, their conversation fading into the hum of distant traffic. A lone busker plays for himself now, the notes soft and private. You can almost imagine the spirits of the past, shoemakers and dock workers, mothers and children, pausing to listen for a moment before continuing on their endless walks through memory. And perhaps that is the gift of remembering a place like this, to see it not only for what it was, but for what it gave. The strength to endure, the ability to blend differences into something whole, the proof that beauty can, and often does, grow in the most unexpected soil. So tonight, as you settle back into your pillow, let the story's edges blur, let the harshness fade, and hold on to the warm glow of a lamplight over a quiet street, the echo of dancing shoes on a wooden floor, the soft murmur of a market waking in the early dawn. Breathe slowly, as if the night itself is drawing a blanket over the city. Inhale the cool, clean air that was once heavy with smoke, and exhale the day's worries into the dark. Tomorrow, the city will be loud again. The pace will quicken, and the noise will fill every street. But for now, we are here, in the stillness, in the safety of distance, in the soft glow of memory. And that is enough. Thank you for walking these streets with me tonight, for listening, for imagining, for remembering. It's time now to rest, to close the door gently on the past and let sleep carry you where it will. The story will be here when you return, as all good stories are. Good night, my friend. May your dreams be gentle, your rest be deep, and may you wake to a day bright with its own kind of music. Until next time, sleep well.